They watched you rise, silently, almost reluctantly, not with admiration, but with something colder, something quieter. The truth is, they never clapped for you because your journey unsettled them. You didn't fit the script they wrote for you. You weren't supposed to outgrow their expectations, surpass their pace, or shine in spaces they still struggled to step into. And when you did, when you bloomed in silence, fought battles they never saw, and stood taller than their imagination ever allowed, they froze. Not out of respect, but out of discomfort. You see, your presence didn't entertain them, it exposed them. Every time you spoke your truth, pursued your dream, healed without their help, you reminded them of their own unrealized potential. That's why the room stayed quiet. That's why the claps never came. Because your light wasn't meant to be cheered, it was meant to reveal, and it did. Your light exposed their shadows. You wonder why they never clapped for you. Why they watched in silence as you poured every ounce of yourself into your growth, into your healing, into becoming something more than what they ever imagined. But here's the truth, your light exposed their shadows. You didn't offend them by existing, you unsettled them by evolving. The very act of you rising, of you choosing the harder path, the higher road, the unspoken dreams, it forced them to face something they weren't ready to confront within themselves. Because your strength revealed their complacency, your bravery reflected their fear, and your vision reminded them of how long they'd stayed in the same place, telling themselves stories of why they couldn't move forward. They didn't clap because they weren't watching to celebrate, they were watching to compare. And every time you overcame something that should have broken you, it reminded them that the chains they claimed couldn't be broken were never locked in the first place. You shattered the illusion. You proved that silence doesn't mean weakness, that kindness doesn't mean surrender, and that consistency, even when no one is watching, builds a power no audience can deny. You walked into rooms without begging for permission, and that was your greatest sin in their eyes. Because people like you, people who endure quietly, who succeed without noise, who refuse to break even when forgotten, you terrify those who depend on validation for survival. You expose them without saying a word, just by continuing, just by existing fully, authentically, unapologetically. You didn't compete, yet you made them feel defeated. You didn't boast, yet your presence made their voices shrink. And so, the applause you deserved never came. Not because you lacked greatness, but because your greatness arrived without needing their confirmation. They wanted you humble, but not confident, kind, but not unshakable, dreaming but not achieving, but you kept becoming, and that became too heavy for them to hold. So no, they didn't clap, not at your promotion, not at your breakthrough, not at your healing, because each time you reached a new height, you reminded them that they too had the power to rise, and they had chosen not to. They'll call you distant now, they'll say you changed, but what really happened is, you grew past the version of you they felt safe around. And the version you are now, it no longer shrinks to fit their comfort. You are no longer the flicker of light they could ignore. You became a mirror, and mirrors don't lie, they reflect. That's why they turned away. That's why they never clapped. They were counting on your doubt. There's something hauntingly quiet about the way they watched you, not with hope, not with support, but with subtle anticipation for your hesitation. They were counting on your doubt, not your failure, no. Failure they could tolerate as long as you stayed confused, unsure, constantly questioning your worth. That's what gave them control. Your self-doubt made them comfortable because it meant you would never walk too far ahead, never rise too high, never speak too boldly. They didn't clap for you because applause would mean acknowledging that you found clarity, and clarity is power. You see, they built their confidence on the illusion that you didn't have any. They grew strong only in the presence of your confusion. And so, when you began to believe in yourself, when you stopped asking for their opinions to validate your every move, something inside them broke. Not because you changed, but because you remembered who you were before they made you forget. They were never afraid of your failure. What they feared was your awakening. That quiet internal shift when your eyes started to see clearly, when your back straightened with resolve, when your voice no longer trembled with permission, seeking. That's the moment they stopped clapping. That's when the smiles became tighter, the silence heavier, and the support conditional. Because self, belief is a threat to anyone who benefits from your insecurity. And the moment you stepped into your truth, their narrative lost its grip. They weren't ready for a version of you that didn't look back every 5 minutes to ask, "Am I enough now?" You stopped needing approval. You stopped apologizing for dreaming out loud. You stopped minimizing your light to soothe their shadows. They called it arrogance, but it was finally you recognizing your value. They called it distance, but it was finally you setting boundaries. And when they saw that the doubt they fed you no longer grew roots, they knew their time in your life was ending. That's why they never clapped. Because to cheer for you would mean accepting that you outgrew the role they assigned you. You were no longer the unsure version of yourself they could manage. You became someone who made decisions without waiting for consensus. You started moving forward, even if it meant walking alone. And that kind of courage, that kind of clarity, it threatens the very foundation of every manipulative bond. So, don't take their silence personally. Don't mistake their absence for proof of your misstep. You didn't lose them. You simply lost the version of yourself that needed them. And now, in the echo of that silence, there is something louder than applause. The sound of your own footsteps, steady, strong, and free. They were counting on your doubt, but instead, you gave them your destiny. And that's something they'll never be able to control, contain, or clap for. Familiarity breeds a quiet rivalry. They knew you before you knew who you were. They saw you in your earliest, rawest form, unpolished, uncertain, still learning how to carry the weight of your own voice. They shared rooms with you, memories with you, maybe even dreams with you. And in that closeness, in that comfort, they grew to believe you'd always stay within reach, never too far ahead, never too different. That's why, when you began to rise, they couldn't celebrate. Because familiarity, when touched by insecurity, breeds a quiet rivalry. They didn't expect to envy you. But when you started moving forward past the fears they still nursed, past the limb they accepted, it triggered something they never planned to confront. Comparison. Not the healthy kind. The quiet, hidden kind that lives behind smiles and passive praise. The kind that claps just softly enough so no one can accuse them of bitterness. You weren't supposed to surpass them. You were supposed to remain side by side, equally stuck, equally unsure. But you didn't. You changed. You grew into your skin, into your voice, into the life you always whispered about, but were once too afraid to claim. And when you did, it felt like betrayal to those who secretly measured their worth by your position. You didn't compete, but they started counting. You didn't boast, but they started shrinking, because deep down they believed that if they were still in the same place, you should have been too. And when you weren't, when you stepped into something greater, it didn't feel like your victory. It felt like their defeat. They say they're proud of you, but their eyes don't light up when you speak. They say they're happy for you, but the silence after your success is louder than any applause. Because your evolution changed the dynamic, you're no longer the one they had to help, comfort, or advise. You became a mirror, and mirrors don't lie. They reflect truths people spend years trying to hide. The truth that you were always capable. The truth that your growth wasn't luck, it was earned. And the hardest truth of all, that while you were working, they were watching. So no, they didn't clap. Because to clap would be to admit that someone from the same background, the same struggles, the same starting line reached somewhere they've never dared to go. That's not easy to accept, especially when ego is louder than love. Especially when applause feels like surrender. But understand this, not everyone who knows you will grow with you. Some will quietly compete with you. Some will resist your change because it highlights their refusal to change. And some will disappear, not because you wronged them, but because your progress made them uncomfortable in their own skin. Let them go. Let their silence be their confession. You never needed their claps. You needed your courage, and you kept it. That's why you're still rising. They only celebrate what they understand. They never clapped for you, not because you weren't worthy, but because they couldn't comprehend the path you walked. People tend to cheer for what makes sense to them, what fits inside the small frame of their understanding. And you were never predictable. You were never simple. You made moves in silence, grew in shadows, healed in places no one thought to look. You made sense to yourself, but not to those who only understand loud victories and visible success. They didn't understand your resilience because you didn't perform your pain. You didn't scream your struggles from the rooftops. You endured quietly. You carried battles in your soul that would have broken them, and you did it without asking for pity, without broadcasting the weight of it all. That's why they never clapped, because your process didn't look like the success stories they recognize. They couldn't label it, so they overlooked it. You see, people celebrate what they can see. They applaud the finish line, not the lonely nights you spent building the strength to get there. They understand trophies, not trauma. They value results, not resilience, and you were never chasing approval anyway. You were chasing healing. You were choosing growth over attention, peace over performance, purpose over popularity. But in a world addicted to validation, your quiet strength confused them. You didn't shout. You didn't prove. You just became. And that kind of transformation, the kind that happens behind closed doors, the kind that doesn't need to be explained, it's hard for people to digest. It doesn't give them a role to play. They can't insert themselves into your story when they never understood the beginning. They waited for you to be louder, more obvious, more like them. But you kept moving from a different compass, one they couldn't read. And that made them uncomfortable, because deep down, people don't always fear failure, they fear mystery. They fear what they can't define, what they can't predict. And you became that. A quiet force. A storm that didn't ask permission. They couldn't trace your steps, so they pretended not to see your climb. But that's not your loss, it's theirs. Because while they waited for you to announce your greatness, you were already living it. Understand this. Your journey won't always be understood. Your evolution won't always be recognized. And your value will often go unnoticed by those who only know how to love the obvious. But that doesn't make you less. That makes you rare. Keep becoming. Keep rising, and let their silence echo louder than applause ever could. Because some people need a spotlight to be seen, but you were built to shine without it. They didn't clap, not because you weren't extraordinary, but because your kind of extraordinary doesn't fit into their small definition of success. Keep going anyway. One day, they'll look back and realize what they missed, and by then, you'll be too far ahead to hear their belated applause. Because your victory wasn't theirs to claim, they watched you win, and said nothing. Not because you didn't deserve the victory, but because they had no part in building it. People love to clap when they feel like they contributed to your success. When they can say, I helped them get there, or I always believed in them. But when your victory is quiet, self-made, and built in isolation, when it belongs only to you, it threatens the illusion they carry about their own importance in your life. That's why they never clapped, because your win wasn't theirs to claim. You rose without leaning on them, without needing their advice, their validation, or their rescue. You struggled in silence and rebuilt yourself piece by piece, brick by brick, without ever announcing your pain or begging for their presence. And when you finally arrived, when you stood at the summit of a mountain you climbed alone, they stood still, not impressed, not proud, just unsettled, because if you could make it without them, what did that say about their role in your story? You see, many people don't want to walk beside you, they want to stand behind you and be thanked. They want their name stitched into your success, even if they never lifted a hand when you were crawling through the dirt. And when that credit never comes, when your light shines without casting their shadow, the clapping stops. The silence begins, and that silence, that's not your failure. That's their discomfort with your independence. That's their quiet realization that you were always stronger than they wanted you to be. That you never needed them the way they hoped you did. They'll call your confidence arrogance. They'll say you've changed. But what's really changed is the narrative. You stopped waiting for them to recognize you. You stopped shrinking so they could feel tall. You stopped giving them chapters in a book they never helped write. And when you did, they realized your triumph was untouchable, a crown they couldn't wear, a story they couldn't rewrite, a success they couldn't insert themselves into. That's why they didn't clap. Not because you didn't earn it, but because your victory didn't benefit them. It didn't serve their ego, it didn't elevate their status, and it didn't leave space for their pride. But don't let their silence make you question your worth. If anything, let it confirm it, because real victory doesn't beg for recognition. It just is, quiet, powerful, unshakable, and when you stand on ground that no one else helped you build, you don't need noise. You need peace, you need purpose, and you already have both. So let them stay quiet. Let them wrestle with their discomfort. While they count the claps that never came, you'll be busy living the life they said you couldn't have. Your victory was never meant to be shared, it was meant to be owned. And you did.